Welcome to the Pack the House Show, where we have conversations about sharing your faith as you walk through life with others.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Pack the House. My name is Andrew Osborne and I'm joined once again by Pastor Jason.
Actually, we are joined once again by you. Welcome back.
That's true, I am back. So thanks for filling in for me last week. And Aaron is with us as well.
Hiya. Yeah, I wasn't here either.
Wait a minute. So last week I was here. Aaron was
Yeah,
here.
Andrew was here. I wasn't here. Becca was here.
Oh, right.
Now you're getting my schedule all confused.
All right.
Yeah.
JK.
What year is it?
So now Aaron and I are both back. That's the point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this week we talked a little bit about Nicodemus and Jesus and when they met and talked about love and the kingdom of God. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So what we saw in the story is that Jesus was willing to have a difficult conversation with Nicodemus and to maybe get into a topic that Nicodemus wasn't expecting. So we want to talk a little bit about how we could do that with our friends and neighbors.
Certainly challenged Nicodemus's way of thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Which worked, by the way. We can talk about that later. It took a while, but it worked.
I mean, I do love how Jesus's main tactic all the way through the Bible is I'm going to confuse the crap out of these people. And then they're going to think about stuff and come back to the realization at the end.
Yeah, Nicodemus walks away, right? But he pops up a couple more times. It takes essentially the entire 3 years of Jesus' ministry for us to find what the Spirit has been doing inside of him in that amount of time.
Right.
But he's like the ultimate Jedi mind trick where he's like, this is what you need to be knowing.
I want to say this about Nicodemus too, because this is some feedback I got from the preaching this weekend that certainly has been true of me. Many times I've heard Nicodemus preached about, and often we hear him portrayed or depicted as sort of an antagonist, or Jesus is sparring with him, trying to put him in his place a little bit. And that's true that the Pharisees often antagonized Jesus. However, Nicodemus comes doing something. The way Nicodemus phrases his question, I think, is really not his question. His assertion is really important. What he says is, "We know that you are the one sent. You are a teacher from God," which, by the way, is exactly what the Pharisees were looking for.
Right.
And so Nicodemus, I think, is a searcher more than anything, certainly more than an antagonist. He didn't show up to Jesus, I don't think, to poke him or antagonize him. He showed up looking for something.
Yeah, and there were times where the Pharisees were trying to trip Jesus up, and it specifically said that, but it didn't say that for this experience with Nicodemus.
That's a great point. And Jesus' interaction with him really isn't of the flavor. When Jesus wants to be mean to Pharisees, he knows how to be mean to Pharisees.
Right.
Yeah.
You'll know when he's putting the smack down.
Well, and I think that's really important too, because I mean, it's so weird. I remember in my childhood, people being like, don't be like Nicodemus, right? Like if Jesus comes to you, you come back. And it's like, I kind of got this weekend that it's like, well, it wasn't that wasn't his process. His process was different. And Jesus kind of knew that, I think. And so it was like, he needed to process his own way. And Jesus, when he went away, Jesus was not like, oh, I'm condemning you for going away from me, right? He was like, no, you've got to do your process to get back to me.
Yeah, right. I think Pastor Scott made this point earlier in the week that when Jesus says, you're the teacher of Israel and you don't understand these things, how you expect other people to, it comes across maybe as like, you're dumb, Nicodemus.
You're the teacher.
Right. Yeah.
But really, he's more saying, this is why I'm here, to explain these things.
You've come to the right place.
Right.
Exactly.
Do what you're doing. Ask the questions, which is an important posture for us too, because again, the part of the point of our message was there are Nicodemuses or Nicodemi.
They're a plural of Nicodemus.
There are Nicodemuses all around us, which is people who certainly will make assertions. I mean, I could give you the modern equivalent of Nicodemus's assertion pretty easily, which is Jesus was a good teacher, has a lot of good things to say.
Yep.
The end.
Yeah.
There are lots of people who make that sort of, I'll call it the halfway assertion.
Yeah.
And so it's important, right? What's our posture toward them? How do we perceive that? Do you perceive that as an attack and then the guards go up? Or is it maybe more like Nicodemus, where there's a genuine question here? And there's even some common ground, right? There's Nicodemus he missed a big piece of the answer, but there's some common ground, right? Jesus was in fact a teacher from God.
Yeah.
He's in fact a teacher from God, so he was not wrong about that.
But he didn't have the whole story.
Yeah, there's just a big puzzle piece. You know, Jesus essentially says to him, you're looking, you're searching, and what you are searching for is here standing in front of you. You don't currently have the eyes or the mindset to see it.
Yeah,
and I think that's so funny because like I always feel like the more that I know, the more I actually have to like hold myself back when I come across somebody that's like that, because it's like I just want to spew everything that I know at them like exactly in that moment to like prove to them, it's like, I mean, that's my natural reaction, and I have to hold myself back and be like, wait a minute, that's not how this works.
It's not what they need right now. Yeah.
Right. So that's what I like about Jesus, because Jesus could have just like flat out laid it all out for Nicodemus, right?
Yeah.
But he's like, I don't want it to be that way. I want you to come to me. I want you to come find me.
I want to make one more point about Nicodemus and the interaction with Jesus, and then we'll talk about like how this relates to us, just because I think this is really cool. Jesus talks to Nicodemus about being born again. And by the way, just briefly, the reason that Nicodemus misunderstands is because the word Jesus uses for again, the Greek word is anathen, and it has two meanings. It can mean again, once more, or it can also mean from above, from God. And so cool. Jesus is saying to him, you must be born anathen. You must be born from above. You must be born of what God offers. Nicodemus hears it as you have to be born a second time. And I'm sure he knows the two meanings, but he gets tripped up over which one Jesus is asking. So that's, again, why Nicodemus is a little bit confused. It's not that he's trying to be obstinate. It's that the thing Jesus is saying is a little bit cloudy. Right. That's not the point I wanted to make. Why does Jesus talk to Nicodemus about being born? The reason is a Pharisee, such as Nicodemus, traces his heritage, his certainty, his salvation, his trust is in his birth, his heritage connected to Abraham. So they trace all their lineage back to Abraham, and they say, because I'm part of Abraham's family, that's how I know I'm within God's plan.
Oh, right.
So the lineage into which Nicodemus was born was his source of hope. Therefore, Jesus talks about what he offers in terms of being born. We can see a similar thing happening with the woman at the well, right? They come to the well. They are thirsty. She is drawing water. So how does Jesus talk about his gospel message? He doesn't talk about born again in that case. He talks about living water.
Right.
The point I want to make is in both cases, we can see Jesus, I'll say, tailoring the message to the situation or the context or the thing the person needs.
Yeah.
That's just a really good skill for us too, right? It's the same gospel message. It's the same thing is being offered, which is relationship with Jesus. Right. But he presents it in the way that matches what the person is looking for or what they need.
Yeah. That's good. So
let's talk a little bit about how
for your situation of that person who they see Jesus is a good guy, but he's not the God of the universe. What does this look like when you're talking with them?
Yeah, I think I would answer that question. I would need to know the answer of one more question. And that question would be, what is it that they're looking for? So this person, this hypothetical person, is incorporating Jesus into their story, into their framework. What are they trying to achieve? Are they feeling hopeless? Then I would present the message of Jesus in terms of hope. Are they feeling maybe lacking purpose, right? Jesus has a lot of nice things to say about purpose. Then I would put the message in terms of finding purpose. Are they lonely? Then I might have a message. I might present it in terms of community or connection. Does that answer the question muddily enough?
I think so.
Yeah, it always makes me think of Paul, where he's like, I've become all things for all people. Like, I mean, like, that's the whole point of the gospel, is like, it is for everybody. You just have to figure out. And that was kind of, what Jesus did better than anything else, was he could see into people's hearts and know exactly what message of his they needed at that time, which we don't have that superpower, obviously.
We don't have the superpower, but we can through conversation, we can start to get an idea of.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. But it just takes us a little longer than like the very first interaction we have with people.
More steps.
Yes.
Him to tell us.
I know, right?
That's kind of the takeaway point is when, before you jump right to the gospel message, is take the time in conversation to find out what it is that they're looking for, how you can best match that up.
Yeah.
And in that way, I think we all have Nicodemuses, where everybody's searching for something.
Yeah.
Right? You're not just like stagnant, like, oh, my left's good, I'm good.
Yeah, some people will say that, right?
Yeah, but that's not reality.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit to the idea of, we called this sermon Needing Love. And the idea is that Jesus gives us an example of love, this interaction with Nicodemus, even as he's being a little bit challenging, as he is not willing to agree or leave Nicodemus where he is. Actually, he doesn't really even agree with Nicodemus.
Yeah.
He doesn't disagree with, he just doesn't address that.
Right.
But he's
Which
not
is a lesson for us.
Yeah. He is not willing to go along or go along with, you're a good teacher, nothing more. This is a picture of what it means for us to be loving. And so I want to talk more about that. Because Nicodemus actually does a thing. We talked a little bit about this before. Nicodemus does a thing that shows up so much in our cultural context right now. As I put it in the sermon, in our cultural vernacular, Nicodemus is speaking his truth. That is what is true for him, which is, for me, Jesus is a good teacher. And I don't really know how to segue into this point, so I might just keep talking and say what I want to say.
That's usually
okay. Can I say one thing about the whole truth situation?
Sure.
Okay, I think when you are trying to form relationships with people, and I don't care who they are, they're in the church, they're out of the church, I think finding that out is very important. So instead of rebutting and coming up against whatever they have to say, I think people are very passionate about what their truth is. And so that can be used as a very good way to build a relationship and actually to get down to who the person thinks that they are and what they are as just a people to themselves. You know what I mean?
I agree with that. And that's the motivation we see in Jesus, right? It's not to come after Nicodemus or get his own point across or score some sort of whatever. And so same thing, the motivation for us ought to be the same, not as you said, I don't want to learn my neighbor's point of view simply to tear it down or rebut it.
Right. Or to tell them what they're doing wrong. Yeah.
At the same time, I do often find that there is something missing in my neighbor's point of view.
For sure.
And that's actually a good segue into what I wanted to talk about is we live in a culture that puts a high value on tolerance and acceptance. That is many times, however it might be expressed, that's kind of at the root of what my neighbor or my coworker's point of view is this idea of tolerance and acceptance. That's what our world says is the loving thing to do, right? And I will agree that's a type of love. It's a type of love that seeks to include everyone and make everyone feel good. And that's valuable. At the same time, very often it doesn't go far enough, right? Which is to say, it doesn't answer the questions that we need answered. That's what we see from Nicodemus, right? He wants to make an inclusive view. Yes, I will incorporate you as a good teacher, but that hasn't met his need yet.
Well, I think a lot of times it's very surface level, right? So like even when I find out somebody's truth, right? It doesn't necessarily go super deep.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And so it's like they're just like floating on top of the surface, and it's like, I want to know why you're floating on top of the surface so I can take you where you need to go.
Yeah, I
And
like
if
that.
yeah, and if I cut them off and I'm like I've had a lot of people where like when somebody says my truth or whatever, they roll their eyes, and it's like that's not helpful.
Well,
like
it's
like
not, and we talk about this
listen
before. It's
to
not,
what their truth actually is.
yeah, that's the ticket to the game right now.
Yeah.
We have to listen to what their truth is, whether we like that or not.
But I like that point because I think a lot of people just haven't thought through the end of their worldview, I guess. So like they know this one thing, they want to care for people, but they haven't thought through what that looks like in every situation. So you don't have to tell them they're wrong if you think that, but maybe dig a little deeper and ask them questions. I think that's a lot less threatening way to explore those ideas, I guess. So
Yeah.
like if I was in a situation where I disagreed with something someone was saying, I wouldn't say you're wrong and this is why. I would say, oh, that's interesting. So what about this situation? Or I would say something like, yeah, I guess the way I see it in my life is blah. So I guess it's just trying to find different ways to maybe talk through situations without being offensive.
I like questions such as, how does that play out for you? Or
Yeah.
how do you see that working? Questions that invite them to tell me how it's going.
Right.
I'll make this point. We'll see if you guys agree with me. In terms of kind of, again, what is I'll use this language. For me, the place where tolerance and acceptance fall short, the reason that it doesn't do what we need it to do, is because our hearts were not designed for that. Even in the garden, right? Even in the midst of perfection, of God's perfect plan, his perfect creation, perfect relationship with him, he's literally walking along beside them. Even in that moment, he puts boundaries. Do not eat from the tree that's in the middle of the garden. Even in that moment, there are guidelines, there are boundaries, there are guardrails. This is what our heart is designed for. And so now we live in a cultural context that says tolerance and acceptance has come to mean essentially anything goes. And there's value to that, right? Certainly we see people who are more welcomed into our society than they would have been. That's great. And yet this is not what our hearts were designed for. So this is why I think that sometimes this way of looking at the world, again, does a lot of good things. We don't have to trash it. Does a lot of good things, but doesn't go all the way to what.
And it takes us to the other extreme where like there are some things that are just not good for you. And is it really loving of me to just stand by while you're doing something destructive without saying anything? I think it's loving sometimes to say, I think you're on a bad path.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit then about how we have that conversation. And Aaron made a good point earlier. Well, you made a couple. I'm trying to set you up to say the one that I want you to say.
Thank you. It's a good thing that's on a recording because I don't think he would have said that otherwise.
Got it on. There's video evidence.
Yeah.
So you made the point about Nicodemus being already kind of, I think you used the word, in the fold.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit more about what you said there?
So I just think that like a lot of times we are talking to people who have no idea, right? Like my husband only knows stuff about like church and Jesus and all that stuff. He only knows what I tell him because he's not like reading the Bible. He's never, he wasn't in church when he was little. He doesn't know any of that stuff. So I think when you come up with somebody who does know stuff, right, it's a bit of a different, you're working from a different playbook, if that makes sense. And so Nicodemus had a lot of knowledge as far as like prophecy and what was going on. He just didn't have the pieces lined up the way that Jesus wanted him to.
Yeah, like in this situation, he's talking to someone who believes there's a God. He probably believed that a Messiah was coming. He believed that God created the world and was still part of the world. Whereas for a lot of us, like I have a lot of friends who, like you said, didn't grow up in the church, don't know that there's a God, or really even seem to care whether there is or not. So it's a different conversation.
Yeah, and so that's why Jesus goes right straight to born again, and I'll use the word challenging Nicodemus's viewpoints pretty directly. For lots of our conversations, it doesn't start there.
Right.
It might start simply with, well, let's talk about that. How do we? Let's take, for example, an early stage relationship, we'll say, which is a person who is not in the place of Nicodemus, who is maybe still even asking the question, is there a God? Should I care about that? Maybe they haven't asked that question yet.
I think a lot of times, like for the people I encounter, it's like, well, I don't need a God. Like I'm in control, or like I am the God. Like there's a lot of like talk about that or whatever. And my go-to phrase all the time is, whew, that's a lot of pressure. I'm like, I'm glad I don't have those pressures.
I like that. Let me press you to to do the next phrase. That's a lot of pressure. Why do you not have that pressure?
Because I have Jesus.
Okay. So what I'm asking you for is, what is a way of pointing them to something new, something different? That's a lot of pressure, but
I don't even think I need that step though, because all these people I'm talking to know that I have God and Jesus. So like they know the reason I don't have those pressures is because I have God.
Okay, but if you did think you needed that step and you did want to say something along those lines,
then I would say probably like, well, God's in control, or something like that.
Yeah, that's a kind of along the lines of what I was thinking.
God's in control of my life, I guess, is what I would say.
I like that piece of my life. It doesn't have to be true for you yet.
Right.
That was along the lines of what I was thinking is how do we begin to point to something more than, this is what Jesus is doing, right? Point to something more than what my friend or my neighbor has, even as they might be a long way from a conversation about being born of the Spirit. And so for me, when you said that, the thing that came into my head was something along the lines of, yeah, that is a lot of pressure. Really helpful for me in those moments that I know I can lean on someone else other than me.
That's a good point.
Yeah, one way that this has come about, and like I've had this situation talking with people, is like that they have a lot of anxiety about like future things in their life. Like they don't know like what job to take or where to live or what to do with their kids. And like the way I've always seen it and the way I try to communicate it is that I put my trust that Jesus knows the things I need and cares about them. And I pray all the time, like, Jesus, open the doors that need to be open and shut the doors that need to be closed. And so far in my life, he has done that for me. And doors have opened that should not have opened, and doors have closed that probably should have stayed closed. And I trust that he's going to lead me where I need to go. And that's way easier on me because I don't have to make the choices. He's going to do it for me.
Right. Yes, I agree with that.
I don't know if this would be like a beginning stage conversation, but I have had a conversation with friends kind of that started this kind of conversation where they're thinking about like what happens when you die and those kind of things. And a lot of times that will bring up these different worldview ideas, is that because they're nervous about what's going to happen when they die because it's all unknown to them. Whereas for me, they see that I have peace about it, and I'm not worried about when I die, because I know I'm going to be with Jesus in a perfect eternity. And so that leads to a lot of opportunity, I think, to have these discussions about what's different.
I agree with that. Let's take one step further. Let's imagine now a conversation or a relationship in which this person is saying maybe there is something more than tolerance and acceptance and make your own way and whatever is true for you goes. Maybe that isn't working for me anymore. When we find ourselves in that moment, number one, let's talk about how do we honor them where they are without, again, trashing the worldview that we don't need to. But then how can we point them to, as you said, Aaron, earlier on, bring them to Jesus? How can we point them to Jesus in that?
Well, I mean, if you read the gospel, Jesus was the number one, like, accepting and tolerant person in the history of the world. Like, he was hanging out with all the people you shouldn't hang out with. He was loving everybody, no matter where they were, no matter their station, no matter what was happening to them. So I just think
I agree with that, but he's also always looking to point them to something more, something better, something different.
But I think that's just because he wants better for them.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like he wants
people around me.
But he wants them to be the best versions of who they are.
He wants as well as have a relationship with the Father that leads to there.
Right. But even that's the thing. Even if I think, which I could be wrong, but even if the people that he was loving never ever changed who they were as people, he would still love them.
Great point. Absolutely agree. However, he is trying to make them have a different point of view.
Well,
he's trying to offer them something else.
The rich young ruler who didn't want to sell everything went away sad because Jesus told him, like, if you want to enter the kingdom, this is what you got to do. And he was like, oh, well, I don't want to do that. And so, like, Jesus, like, while he was accepting and loving, he also, like, was direct in saying, this isn't the lifestyle you need. You need to change your lifestyle.
Yeah, a different one will be better for you. Both as it relates, and your point is correct, a different way of thinking and looking at the world will be better for you. Both as it relates to your own self, you'll be the best version of yourself, but also you are welcome into this kingdom of God. That's what I want you to see.
Right.
So
I want people to see that even if they never change who they are, I mean, obviously we have hope that they're going to change who they are, but even if they don't, like, we're still going to love them.
Yes, I agree with that. I also want, because we're on a podcast that is trying to help others have those conversations, I would like to go beyond, maybe they never will or never have to.
Okay.
Try to help our listeners try to have the conversations that might lead to that.
I think showing people what could be is very attractive.
Yeah. When you mean showing, you mean by your actions?
By my actions or even my words, like we said earlier, where it's like, I don't have the anxiety that you have because I put my faith in something that's bigger than me and bigger than everybody else. And so I don't need to put my faith in humans. I have faith in the guy that created it all.
Here's the way that this tolerance and acceptance thing often plays out for me, and how I connect it with faith is one of the things that is true is this is an exhausting way to live, to always be on one's guard for did I make a microaggression and ought I have said this differently? Is this okay to do or to subscribe to, or do I have to stop being a part of that? Is this person can't? It's an exhausting way to live, and I'm not trying to talk down the worldview. What I have often said is, again, all those things, lots of those things have value. There is certainly value in treating people the right way and not supporting those who treat them the wrong way. Mm-hmm. And yet, one of the reasons that I don't get so worked up about that is because my relationship with Jesus, my faith, I would say either of those things, depending on who I'm talking to, my faith or my relationship with Jesus gives me some certainty. It gives me a foundation to stand on. The challenge, I think, for so many people is that tolerance and acceptance is a great goal, but it's almost bottomless. On its own, it's never finished. This is Tim Keller's point. On its own, there's no end to it. There's no bottom to it. My faith, my relationship with Jesus can give a foundation for that. It can help us know when, something to stand on, something to rest in. So those might all be phrasings that you could use. This is, I rest in my faith. I don't get as worked up or as upset because I had my faith gives me that foundation.
And I actually think that the tolerance and acceptance, that whole thing, has been a replacement for steadfast love, right? Because we get steadfast love, we get that. And so I think it's the world trying to create its own steadfast love, but without saying that, because that's so biblical, right? That's so Jesus.
That's really
and so
So what you're saying then, if I hear it correctly, is the goal of tolerance acceptance is always be loving.
The goal of tolerance and acceptance is to create a loving environment without using the word love. They're almost trying to manufacture it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the way Jesus did it was he wasn't manufacturing anything, right? And I feel like if we have relationship with people, and we have a loving relationship with somebody, we're automatically going to have that tolerance and acceptance. We don't need to be forced into it. You know what I'm saying?
I agree with that. And also your point made me think of something else. When you say that it is trying to create a certain environment, I absolutely agree with you. It's certainly a project to create a type of world. And that world has a lot of overlap with what we would call the kingdom of God. Absolutely. Here's a way that we can connect those two together in common ground, is to say, I am looking forward to whatever it is you neighbor, coworker, friend are looking for. I want the world to be A, B, C, and D. Mm-hmm. The way that I could foresee having that conversation is to say, yeah, I'm looking forward to all those things too. For me, I happen to believe that they come through the work that God is doing in the world, and I want to be a part of that. So it's that same thing we've said before. There are multiple ways of getting at this. Mm-hmm. For me, it comes through my relationship with Jesus. I believe it's what God is doing in the world, and I want to be a part of that. Right.
Yeah.
But I do think we need to be really intentional about not being sin police when it comes to these conversations.
True. The gospel changes hearts more than the law.
Right. Which is hard.
I only push back on that. I'm not saying we should be sin police, but
Andrew will get you a little badge.
Hey, wait, I want a badge. We're giving badges.
Is there a line where you're being so tolerant and accepting that you're not being loving anymore? Like if someone is doing something that's destructive, or and you're not willing to say anything to help get them back on a path that's less destructive, is that loving? Because you don't want to offend them, you want to be tolerant of what they're doing, but it's a thing that's going to hurt them in the long run.
Andrew, are you referring to people who are
making to not say anything?
Are you referring to people whose actions or choices are actively damaging to them or people they care about?
Yes, but also spiritually, things that they wouldn't see maybe in this lifetime.
I'll answer both then. Obviously, if a person's way of looking at the world leads them to do things that are damaging to them, certainly you want to do your best to speak into that. And by the same token, this is to your other point of maybe it's not hurting them, but they're just missing something spiritually. This is, again, why I've been pushing so hard for accepting and pointing to something more. which is to say, I will walk along with you as your friend, as your neighbor, even while you are doing the thing that I think is less than what God has best for you. All the time, I want to be looking for opportunities to point you to that best thing.
Right.
So I have to say, we are actually going through that exact situation in my life right now with someone. And we have noticed that we can't make him make good decisions. That's not our job, right? But every time he comes at us and tells us about a decision he's going to make, we say that's a bad decision, right? But then we don't keep saying it. You know what I mean? Like, then he's going to go and he's going to do the bad decision that he's decided to do anyway. And you can't stop him from doing the bad decision. The only thing that we can do is stay here and stay constant in his life and stay where he knows that he's going to be loved no matter what.
Right.
And keep pointing him to Jesus.
Right. And so we just keep like every time he comes up with another bad decision, we're like, that's a bad decision. And but if we were to keep saying like, that's a bad decision, that's a horrible thing, don't do that. Like, if we were to keep saying it over and over again, he's heard us the first time we told him it was a bad decision. So we don't need to keep calling him every week and telling him it's a bad decision. You know what I mean? He knows where we stand on the subject. So rather than keep talking about it and possibly deteriorating the relationship, we decide that we're going to tell him when he makes before he makes a bad decision, we're going to say, that's not a good decision. And then we're going to keep loving him throughout all the bad decisions he's making.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Say what's true, right? There is more for him. I don't think this is it.
Right.
You don't have to hammer them in the head every time you see them.
Right. And actually, I think the better witness is that we're still loving him, even though he keeps making these bad decisions. Right.
Well, like you said,
so, and he knows we think they're bad decisions, and it's like, but we're still going to be here and we're still going to love you. Even when this turns out the way that we knew it was going to turn out. We don't say, I told you so. You know what I mean? We just keep loving him, even though he continues to make the same bad decisions over and over again. And maybe someday he won't. I mean, that's what the hope of Jesus gives us,
But I think there is it depends on the relationship too. So like there's times where like I've had a friend who I'm not super close with, but has told me something that they're into that I don't think is good for them. But we don't necessarily have the relationship where I could tell them that. A lot of times like they probably know how you feel about it. So saying it isn't always the best thing. There are times when it's better to hold your tongue, probably.
Yeah, and yet we've gone real long, but
this is a big topic, though.
Here's Andrew. I agree with you. Sometimes I'm not in the relational position to directly say, don't do that. But what I could foresee is a question along the lines of, what do you get out of that?
Right. Yeah.
It really helps me. I don't know what it is. Whatever that is, there's generally, like, probably for me, there's something of my relationship with Jesus that fills that need for me.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So if you're not at the point where you directly want to call it out, but you do want to say something that points in toward Jesus, maybe that intermediate step of, tell me a little bit about why you chose that. What's it doing for you?
Yeah.
And then that thing probably is something that Jesus speaks to, or the need that he fills, a need that he fills.
Right.
Should we wrap up?
I think so.
Okay.
That was a good combo. That was a lot to unpack.
A lot to unpack. We could go twice as long, but nobody wants that.
It was worth it.
All right. Well, Pastor, you want to pray for us?
Sure. Father, thank you for not only giving us the model of Nicodemus, Jesus, hanging with him even as he came with an incomplete answer, as he came missing something important that he was looking for, but thank you also for loving us that way, for giving us what we're looking for, even sometimes before we looked for it. Lord, with that model in mind, help us to approach our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, who do have a certain way of looking at the world that often comes up short. Help us to approach them not with the mindset of how we can get our point across or how we can come after them, but how we can offer them the rest of the story, the rest of what you have for them. That is the hope and the certainty that we have. And that we would, as Andrew said, have the right open doors and the right closed doors at times to keep the relationship strong until that moment when they can come to know you better. In Jesus' name we pray that. Amen.
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 Thanks, Pastor. And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Have a
Bye.
great week.
Thanks for joining us for the Pack the House show. For more content like this, or to connect with us, visit our website, cornerstonelutheran.church.